today to talk about. Bill, I just have to say, as the CEO of the National Academy, I'm just so grateful for your leadership. In addition to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we both share a love of Bobby Kennedy and his commitment to ending poverty. And in fact, the organization I now lead, Community Change, was founded to be a living memorial to Bobby Kennedy's fight to end poverty in America. Thank you, Bill, for your leadership in exploring the new risks to American families in this period, especially families of color. That is the risks that are posed by a range of disruptive changes, including economic inequality, insecurity, volatility, racial and gender injustice. And thanks for your bold exploration of new ideas like assured income and the efforts to create a 21st century model of social insurance that we so desperately need. And thanks, of course, to the staff and board of the National Academy, and especially to my friends Indy and Rebecca Vallis. Thanks so much for your leadership. So I want to start by saying that we all share the same goal, as Jim Roosevelt just reminded us: economic security for all, not just some, as we've done before. And you've heard a lot of great ideas at this conference already. I know you heard from Jeremy Greer, who talked about what is an oppression economy and what's the goal of a liberation economy. I know you've heard from Derek Hamilton, my dear friend, around an economic bill of rights. I know you've heard from Sandy Darity around job guarantee. I know you've heard from Aisha Yanduro, very, 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 very powerful leader around the case for guaranteed income in Mississippi among low-income Black women. I know there's been lots of discussion on the child allowance proposal and the case for unconditional cash for families with kids. My friend Rebecca Vallis talked about the inadequacy of our Social Security disability programs to assure income among people with disabilities. And of course, as we gather here today, we are virtual because of COVID and all the ways in which this pandemic has pulled back the curtain on our public policy failings pre-pandemic, including the gross and extreme inequality affecting all Americans, but especially Americans of color. So we are at a moment that I like to think of as the combination of Reconstruction meets the New Deal meets the Great Society. That is the political moment in which we find ourselves. And the question is, will we rise to the occasion, and how do we solve some of the most intractable fundamental problems of our society, our democracy, and our economy? So some facts first, because I wear one hat as a card-carrying political scientist, I wear another hat as an organizer. So I'm gonna put on the political scientist hat first, and then I will put on my organizing hat. So where are we as we gather here today? All the jobs lost in December of 2020 were held by women, primarily Black and Latino workers. Economic security, we know, isn't a new challenge, and it should not be a partisan issue, because even before the pandemic, wealth and income inequality were at historic highs, and it's unacceptable. It is unacceptable that people who are working 2 or 3 jobs can't afford basic necessities in this country, the richest democracy in the history of the world. The US, with all its wealth and prosperity, we know that it's not shared broadly. 40%, something like 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. We know the median net worth of white households is of magnitudes higher than that of Black households and Latinx households. We know that women, and particularly women of color, are the most likely to live in poverty and are overrepresented in low-paying occupations, far more likely to lack access to sick leave or healthcare benefits. We know about the racial and gender wage gaps. We know about the wealth gaps. And then that was all before COVID-19, a year ago, hit us. And of course, COVID-19 has further exposed the economic fragility of most American households, disproportionately impacting Black and brown people. In some ways, COVID-19 has put us in the midst of another Great Depression, and that necessitates bold New Deal type investments in our people and in our social safety net. We live in a time of pandemics. Now, it might be COVID-19 last year and this year, but it could be an earthquake next year. It could be a hurricane the year after. It could be a fire in some places like California. In some places, it's all of these catastrophes for which social insurance and the concept of social insurance is supposed to protect people. We need to build economic resilience in our cities now, and only robust social insurance can get us there. Now, solutions that are focused only on employment and wages will inevitably leave people out, and they will fall short of what Americans actually need. So yes, we need to expand unemployment benefits, particularly for those hardest hit. We should complement them with direct cash payments to help people that aren't working. We also need to stop tying our benefits to the employment relationship. Just yesterday, the California Future of Work Commission released their report making the case very robustly for an old idea of portable benefits, right? The idea that health insurance or other kinds of benefits would not be tied to your employment status. Of course, we all know that we're in a K-shaped recovery and that many will go back to work for less pay and fewer hours, while the wealthy will continue to get richer. And of course, as costs rise, people need more money to meet basic needs. Job losses and school and childcare closures mean that people now have many expenses they did not have before. Paying for health insurance as well as medical bills, providing more meals at home, trying to patch together healthcare, the unexpected cost of the upending of normal daily life. Now, the Biden administration, as Mr. Roosevelt already said, has indicated its support of a lot of things, right? This is sort of a New Deal moment around stimulus aid and recurring checks and SNAP expansion, child allowance that would lift millions and millions of people out of poverty. But we need all ideas on the table, whether it's assured income, whether it's guaranteed jobs, whether it's portable benefits. So that's sort of where we are. And most of you here are researchers and analysts, and I used to be one of you as a card-carrying political scientist, and we need your expertise. We need your rigor. We need your integrity in this moment. We need your analysis. But analysis only leads to winnable strategy under some conditions. And I want to speak to some of those winnable strategies. How do we actually advance the goal of economic security for all? So I'm going to put on my practitioner hat right now, my organizer hat, because I want to talk about politics and power. How do bold, exciting new ideas go from just an idea to reality? And to explore this, I want to go back in time for a little bit, not to the 1930s, as Jim Roosevelt did. I actually want to go back only 10 years to 2011. We live in a radically different world, and for lots of reasons, but especially politically, than we did in 2011. As I said earlier, this is our Reconstruction moment. This is our New Deal moment. This is our Great Society moment for the 21st century. And how do we make it so? So a few examples from 10 years ago. You might remember in 2010 and 2011, there have been lots of studies and decades of research on income inequality and wealth inequality in America. But in September of 2011, there were a group of folks that went down and literally occupied Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. This was a disruptive protest that went viral in cities around the country and around the world. And it was this strategic disruption in this moment 10 years ago, the strategic disruption by a social movement, whether it's the Townsend movement or Occupy Wall Street, that really reset the agenda and the conversation. It was agenda setting, that little period of protests. And we've been having a different conversation about inequality since. What many of us knew in the research already about the 1% became a meme, the 1% versus the 99%. And it is stuck in our conversation. Or to take another example from 10 years ago, Occupy Wall Street happens in September 2011, but less than a year later, a group of organizers and low-wage fast food workers, mostly Black and brown, had this radical idea for $15 an hour minimum wage and a union. Now, I have to say, I was actually in on some of those early conversations, and it was really a crazy idea. And part of my job at the time, when I was still teaching, was to help recruit some economists to support the idea. I had a hard time recruiting economists who would publicly come out in favor of $15 an hour. I can count on one hand how many we could recruit. People said the sky would fall, that the workers should go for $9 or $10 an hour. And so the workers ignored, thankfully, those experts, those economists, and they organized and they disrupted normal politics with one-day strikes, and they won legislation in cities and states around the country. They won corporate policy changes, whether at Costco or, yes, Walmart or Target. And so now we're having, 10 years later, a national conversation about $15 an hour. That was unimaginable in 2011. Or to take another example that's near and dear to my heart, this crazy idea of guaranteed income, not a new idea. Now, Stockton, California, just released yesterday their first wave of results from their pilot program around guaranteed income. And the early data from this guaranteed income demonstration in Stockton proves what we've intuitively known to be true, that people are working, but the economy is not. And those recipients, by the way, spend that money on basic needs like food and transportation and utilities and rent. And yes, the sky did not fall, and only 1% of their spending went towards cigarettes and alcohol, which is one of the boogeymans that we often hear if you give people money. Now, not to go on and on about guaranteed income, but just to say two things. One is the idea of guaranteed income is rooted not in Silicon Valley. It is actually rooted in a history of racial justice. Whether it was Dr. King or the Black Panther Party who called for guaranteed income and guaranteed jobs. They did not see those things as mutually exclusive, as effective solutions to poverty, not magic bullets. And so this was a crazy idea, not on the radar in 2011. And as of today, we have the results of the first modern pilot with 40 mayors around the country, mostly Black mayors, whether Newark or Gary or Atlanta or St. Paul or Oakland, who are ready to do pilots to make a difference in people's lives, particularly low-income people. Or to take one other example, going back to 2011, how many conversations were we having about the care economy or about the unpaid labor of care work, particularly done by women and women of color? It wasn't even on the political agenda. And there has been a radical shift in the conversation through years of organizing and the lifting up the voices of care workers, whether childcare workers or long-term care workers, overwhelmingly women and women of color. So we are at a very different moment. And the question is, how did we get from 2011 to 2021? So lots of books and articles and studies have been written about all of these ideas. And all of that research and expertise has been necessary, but it's not sufficient for change. What is sufficient, along with that deep expertise, is organizing and coalition building and radical experimentation. And sort of, you might think of it as a climate change in our political conversation to expand what's politically possible. But I want to encourage you to look for other kinds of experts and expertise from workers themselves, from low-income people themselves, and how can we imagine a collaboration with researchers, with other kinds of experts like organizers and people most directly affected on the ground. In this moment in 2021, we now know that racial and gender justice have to be central to economic security. We have to learn our lessons from that bold era of the 1930s of creating our system of social insurance, but of course, with exclusions. 2021, no more exclusion. Affirmative radical inclusion of everybody, and particularly those most affected, particularly Black and brown workers. We also need innovative leaders who are willing to experiment, whether it's someone in the White House or someone in the mayor's office or a governor, or frankly, someone like Aisha Yandoro, who just decided she was going to do her own thing, her own radical pilot in Mississippi, without the support and without the funding, but to do it because she trusts Black women in Mississippi to do the right thing with cash. So we need expertise, we need researchers in collaboration with folks on the ground. Last but not least, to build a 21st century system of social insurance, we need bold ideas, but we need also strategic organizing to bend political will to make it happen. Policy doesn't happen without power and the democratic power of ordinary people willing to fight for it. So how do we design policies in this moment of social insurance with feedback loops that build the political will and power for ordinary people and those most affected? How do we think about the lessons, for instance, of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, the right to organize for the first time in American history in the private sector, that built the 20th century labor movement, that created a feedback loop of worker power, that expanded the safety net for people throughout this country in the middle of the 20th century? Or how might we imagine the 21st century version of Social Security, another perfect case of policy feedback, which we now think of it as the third rail of politics because it created a built-in constituency of people willing to fight for that policy of social insurance? Or how might we imagine the child allowance today? Yes, we might get a short-term victory of temporary child allowance for families struggling to make ends meet. But how do we then, as organizers, go out and ask people, how is that working out for you? How is it working out for your kids? And do you want to join the fight to make it permanent? That is how we build a multiracial coalition of people most affected, along with experts and researchers, to create new policies that actually deliver on economic security. This is our Reconstruction moment. This is our New Deal moment. This is our Great Society moment for the 21st century. It is an all hands on deck moment. And as a friend from the Movement for Black Lives likes to say, we're all on the superhighway to freedom. And it is an all hands on deck moment. But we don't have to be in the same lane as long as we're heading in the same direction. So let's all hands on deck. This is our superhighway to freedom, to dignity, to economic security for all. We need you in this moment. We need you to cast down your buckets where you are and join the fight to make some of these bold ideas a reality. Thank you very much. And thanks for allowing me to join you today.